Hello, chapter 2. Bad to worse. In the morning, Mistress Poacher escorted them through the streets of Uptown towards the great dome of the Geographical Society. The siblings were silent as they trudged along, still trying to make sense of the terrible news. Arthur's iron arm jolted against his side, banging out a numbing rhythm with every other step. Maud had etched a Brightstorm moth onto a flat metal panel just above the wrist, and now reflected a dancing patch of light onto the walls along the streets as they walked. As the watchtower began its first chime of 9, they turned the corner to the Longtime Geographical Society. The square bustled with people filtering towards the society building. A few people stared as they noticed Arthur's arm. He tried not to feel self-conscious. People stared if he wore it. They stared more if he didn't. Dad had always told him not to care what people thought, but it seemed harder without his father by his side. Arthur paused to watch a group buzzing around a nearby Longtown Chronicle stand. He caught a glimpse of the headline, "Break-in, Death in the Frozen South, What Really Happened, Speculation Rises." Arthur tried to swallow, but his throat tightened. Maudie was staring too. Mistress Poacher glanced over her shoulder. "Come along!" Then she paused, and for a moment Arthur thought she would say something kind. Instead, she took a comb from her bag and passed it to him. "For goodness sake, run this through your hair, Arthur. Your father may have found it acceptable for you to run wild, but you can't very well be in the company of the finest in Longtown with hair worse than a floor brush. Maudie, you should be wearing the skirt I laid out for you, not those old house slacks. At least tuck in your shirts, both of you," she tutted. They followed her up the stone steps, through the carved doorway, and into a grand hall. Majestic pillars and gilt-framed maps lined the walls, illuminated by glittering chandeliers. Statues of the great explorers with notable achievements stared from the sides. All around the hall bustled with the people of Longtown, chattering and anticipation fizzing in the air. The sound made Arthur want to scream out. How could anything carry on as normal when this world had been ripped apart? He forced himself to focus. He had to get through this for Maudie, if not for himself. She looked across, and he knew she was thinking the same as him. They pushed onwards towards the double doors of the auditorium. Some of the most respected explorer families in Longtown walked ahead of them. Rumpole Blurrington, 5 times as wide as his wife, beside him, dressed in a plush velvet coat and top hat. Dad said he'd never achieved much and lived a lavish lifestyle on the exploration achievements of his great-grandmother. Arthur glimpsed Evelyn Aquafrida to his side, a tiny woman in the blue jacket and trousers, as though it had been made from the skin of an exotic sea creature. She upheld her family tradition of refusing to embrace the advances from sea to sky ships and preferred to persist solely with ocean exploration. Hilda Hilbery pushed past Maudie, her nose in the air. "Do excuse me," she said, sounding as though she didn't much care to be excused at all. She stood half a head taller than most in the room, even without her ribbon flowerpot hat, her stature matching her family's achievements in claiming the peaks of the most mountains in the first continent. In the auditorium, people were bustling around filling seats, so Mistress Poacher hurried Arthur and Maudie to a few vacant chairs on their right. Soon a loud clang rang through the room as the great doors behind them shut, to disappointed shouts on the other side. A great arc of people gathered on the stage at the front. Arthur tried to make out who they were. Most seemed to be officials from the Geographical Society, and another group dressed in a less exuberant, more severe style. Madame Gainsford banged a hammer on the table, and after a few last scuffles, Silence fell. One woman transfixed Arthur. Her beauty was undeniable. She was dressed from head to toe in a pale shade of pink, and on her jacket she wore a distinctive silver brooch in the shape of an exotic insect, something like the dragonflies of the northern marshes, but larger, perhaps something replicating a creature from the tropical east. He'd seen her picture in the Longtown Chronicle. Dora Vane, of the most famous explorer family in Longtown. She was the leader of the other expedition that had been trying to reach South Polaris alongside her father's. Madame Gainsford stood up. Esteemed members of the Geographical Society and the many interested citizens of Longtown, this urgent meeting has been called to determine the truth of the recent events. The expedition to the South Polaris was intended to uncover what lies as the southernmost point on the compass, expanding our knowledge of geography and the very structure of this planet, as reported. The expedition not only failed in its main objective, but ended in catastrophe. Whispered chatter rippled around the auditorium. Arthur and Maudie drew closer together. Madame Vane, perhaps if you could address the first board, can you tell us exactly what happened? Adora Vane stood up. Her voice carried through the hall, clear and honeyed. We were in the second continent at the last post. We landed our skyship, the Victorious, for the night to replenish a few last supplies, and for the crew to rest before heading off at first light. Pitch supplies were scarce, but we'd managed to stock up with just enough to make it across the third continent and back. Maudie leant in towards Arthur and whispered, Please let him not have been foolish enough to run out of pitch in the third continent. Arthur didn't answer. Dad was meticulous at calculating fuel. The Brightstorm skyship, the Violetta, landed at the last post shortly afterwards. We exchanged greetings and ate together around the fire in the spirit of comrade explorers, even though, of course, we were rivals to reach South Polaris first. We wished each other luck and went to bed, each needing to take the opportunity of gathering strength before the Polaris journey. Little did we know it was the last time we'd see them alive. The auditorium hung off her every word. There was complete silence. Arthur tried to steady his breathing as a great black wave of sadness washed over him, pressing down, drowning him. He looked around the auditorium, searching in the vain hope that Dad would appear and that it had all been a terrible mistake. During the night, I was woken by the hum of the Violetta's engines. At first, I thought they were trying to take an advantage. I wasn't concerned, as I knew the Victorious was the fastest ship and would catch up. Madame Vane paused, a frown bending her brow. Perhaps my chief engineer, Mr. Wicket, should take it from here. A man further along the line stood up, the screech of his chair rasping through the theatre. He was obviously much less comfortable speaking to a huge crowd. He coughed, then mumbled something. You'll need to speak up, Mr. Wickets, Madame Gainsford said, shaking her head. Mr. Wickets cleared his throat. The engines of the Violetta woke me up too. I thought I'd better make a start on the engine checks, as Madame Vane would be sure to want to take off soon. I went down to the engine room and the stores. I couldn't believe what I saw. He paused. What did you see, Mr. Wickets? He turned his palms upwards. It was almost empty. The audience gasped. Madame Gainsford frowned deeply. Mr. Wickets, could you elaborate for us? He cleared his throat. The outside hatch had been broken. A great hole gaped in the bottom of the Victorious, so I could see the ground below. The pitch had been stolen, and the Violetta had already taken off. The only other people at the last post was the watcher, and she could hardly empty a ship of pitch alone in the night. I mean, the population is hardly booming down there. Besides, we questioned her, and she had an alibi. She'd been invited to the ship's mess for a drink with Captain Vane and the rest of the crew. Madam Gainsford narrowed her gaze. Just to be absolutely clear, Mr. Wickets, are you suggesting that your supplies were stolen by the Brightstorm crew? He nodded. The audience erupted as people turned to those nearby to exclaim their thoughts. Maud grabbed Arthur's hand. Dad wouldn't do that, Arthur said, his voice shaking. Madam Vane raised her hand a little, and the audience quiet to listen. Perhaps I should continue. A couple in front of Arthur and Maudie began looking over their shoulders at them. They tapped the people in front and said something. Soon a ripple of whispers fluttered through the audience, with more people turning to look. Maudie squeezed his left hand tighter, and Arthur did his best to ignore the stares and focus on Madam Vane. We weren't going to give up on our dream of reaching South Polaris that easy, so we used the little fuel that remained in our stores to head back inland to find more pitch. It cost us valuable days, and we paid a hefty price. Then we battled onwards across the sea, where the rough weather was every bit as terrible as reported, and set us back again. On reaching the third continent, we crossed a great frozen forest. Beyond were enormous sheer mountains, too high for a skyship's balloon. We were forced to land on a snow plain before an expansive icy lake, which skirted the mountains as far as could be seen. Our calculations told us that South Polaris was on the other side of the mountains. The way forward was on foot. We saw the Brightstorm ship had landed nearby. We assumed an advance party had proceeded and left the rest of the crew at the ship, but when we approached the Violetta, we found it was completely empty. Everything was left as though the whole crew had suddenly abandoned it. There were tools discarded, equipment strewn. The fuel tanks were nearly full, at a far higher level than they should have been, but the crew had simply disappeared. Disappeared? Yes, as we looked more closely, it was apparent from the state of the disarray. There had been a terrible fight. Then we saw them. The crew? Endora Vane shook her head and looked at the floor. She became pale. Despite what they had done to us, I wouldn't wish this upon any fellow explorer. Go on. We found traces of animal tracks around their ship, but like nothing we had come across before in all our travels of the Wide. There were huge paw prints, the length of 2 human feet at least. The Brightstorm crew had clearly been attacked by wild beasts. There were traces of blood in the snow, but nothing else. I fear no one had survived. Arthur's breath caught in his lungs. It was too horrible to take in. Madam Vane, did you see those foul creatures? Yes. She signalled to someone at the side of the auditorium. The crew managed to capture one. The audience gasped audibly, and 2 of her men disappeared backstage for a moment, then returned carrying what appeared to be an enormous pile of fur between them. Leaning forward, Arthur saw 2 pointed shapes. Ears, a great black nose, and teeth like daggers. It was an animal pout. They threw it down on the table before the members of the Geographical Society as the audience began muttering in horrified astonishment. Madam Gainsford walked around the pout, inspecting it. This creature's shoulders must have reached the height of a human. Indeed, said Madam Vane. The stoat buried its head in Madam Gainsford's collar. Do continue with your recount, Madam Vane. We still want to try and reach beyond the mountains to South Polaris to salvage something from the disaster, but we soon realised the lake had become impassable. A sudden thaw had set in, and the ice was terribly unstable. We couldn't be sure of getting across safely, let alone back. The mountains stretched as wide as we could see, and the lake was too vast. We didn't have enough equipment to go onwards, and morale was low after what we'd been through. The board nodded, agreeing with her decision. We travelled back knowing we'd need to make another attempt when the weather was favourable, and we were better equipped for the mountain crossing. Adora Vane dipped her head and sat down. Madame Gainsford shuffled the papers before her, then stood up. Thank you, Madame Vane. If that is all your crew has to say on the matter. She paused, but the crew remained silent. The board will discuss and reach a conclusion tomorrow. She turned to the audience. Since neither expedition managed to reach South Polaris after all, we will also discuss the possibility of relaunching the prize fund. As no one has encountered this impenetrable ring of mountains before, it is clear further exploration is needed to find a way through. I would like a full report of what you observed, Madame Vane. Close by, Arthur heard a man mutter that Ernest Brightstorm and his crew got what they deserved if they'd broken the code, that it was nature's way of justice. The woman beside him said that it was proof there was no place for new-blooded explorers. They didn't respect the old ways and should leave it to the respected families. The people looking at them weren't the kindly eyes of people concerned that two children had just lost their only parent. They were all looking at them as they were seeing Ernest Brightstorm, and they'd already judged him. Okay, chapter 3 later on.